Welcome to the Science Salon podcast. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. If you're watching this is our new studio here in Santa Barbara. Madecraft is a production company that's owned and run by my cousin, Brad. So thank you, Brad, for hosting us here today. My guest this week is Daniel Oberhaus. His book is Extraterrestrial Languages. So this is about making contact with extraterrestrials. Either we get their signal, we send a signal. How are we going to communicate with them? What's the difference between communication and language? Turns out to be a super huge subject. And then the technology of how you would encode that in some signal and send it out to space. And this gets into the nature of evolution, the laws of physics, what are extraterrestrials going to be like? It's got to be constrained by the same laws of physics we have here, and presumably the same laws of biology and evolutionary biology, and so on. So we get into all that all the way up to, at the end, who speaks for Earth, and why, even if we never make contact with extraterrestrials, which admittedly the chances are very low, but that doesn't matter, because really it's a way of getting us to think about our species as a whole, our planet as a whole, who speaks for our species, and what it means to be human, what it means to be intelligent, what it means to be able to reason abstractly, and even morality, which we get into at the end of our conversation. So with that, I appreciate your support for the Science Salon podcast. As usual, it's part of the Skeptic Society and our 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission it is to promote science and reason and critical thinking. So if you support that, please offer your support at skeptic.com/donate or through Patreon. With that, I give you Daniel Oberhaus, Extraterrestrial Languages. Thanks for tuning in. Well, congratulations on the new book. It's called Extraterrestrial Languages, with this curious cover and no subtitle. And I'm always curious about how people pick books and covers and titles and subtitles and so on. I think one or the other, the title or the subtitle, should tell you what the book is about. You've kind of done it in two words, Extraterrestrial Languages. Well, we don't know of any extraterrestrials, so what in the world is this book about? If you want to start there.
Yeah, it's about the challenges of communicating with extraterrestrials, broadly speaking. So it deals with everything from how you'd actually encode a language in terms of radio waves or lasers, to the logical problems involved with constructing a message, and then finally the sorts of things you might want to include in a message topic-wise.
Right. So just to kind of break it down, we have SETI, which most people are familiar with, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Then we have SETI with a C, communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. And then METI, which is messaging extraterrestrial intelligence. So maybe just quickly walk through those three different categories of how scientists think about this problem.
Sure. So SETI is focused on the search. As its name suggests, they're not really concerned with designing messages or really thinking too much about how to communicate should we receive a message. So that was actually kind of where it all started with Frank Drake back in the 60s. That was quickly parlayed into communication with extraterrestrial intelligence, or SETI, which is focused on bidirectional communication. So not only how to search for extraterrestrials, but also how to reply should we receive a message, or if we want to kind of preempt things, how would we go about showing ourselves to the universe? And then finally, there's METI, which is purely focused on designing messages with the intention of sending them through interstellar space.
Right. So how did you get interested in this topic? You've written for Wired, right? So you're into a lot of this stuff anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard not to be interested in the idea of extraterrestrial life. I mean, I've yet to meet someone who hasn't at some point or another looked up at the stars and, wondered what else could possibly be out there. So I think it's a really natural impulse to think about these sorts of things. And, kind of just from this personal interest, I started looking into the history of how we've actually gone about communicating and what that would look like. I became really for the purpose of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. So I wrote an article about him for The Atlantic, and it kind of snowballed from there into a bigger project.
Yeah, the poor internet connection, I lost about a sentence or two there. You were writing about who for Wired magazine?
So this was actually an article for The Atlantic, and it was about a Dutch mathematician named Hans Freudenthal, who was doing work in the 20th century on how to teach mathematics.
Oh, right. Yeah. I have to agree. I've been interested in this, since college, really reading Sagan's. He did 2 books. He did one with that Russian scientist, then he did another one by himself. I read Communication with Extraterrestrial Intelligence, and then later I found one he did with, who was the Russian scientist he wrote it with?
Iosif Shklovsky.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that guy. And then, that's right. There it is. Intelligent Life in the Universe. Yeah, 1966. I think I read that in the early 70s or so. But this was in my religious days. I was a born-again Christian for about 7 years, and then I was a born-again atheist after that, and then I'm sort of a born-again agnostic now. I'm not sure what label I use, but there is that a sense that there's that impulse that there's somebody else out there, something out there. And really, what's the difference between an all-powerful, all-knowing God and an extraterrestrial intelligence so sufficiently advanced that it would be indistinguishable from omniscience and omnipotence? That we're really talking about the same thing. So what you're after here is, in a way, religious people would be interested in. How would I communicate with God? Because you're kind of asking the same question.
Absolutely. And, I think interestingly enough, Umberto Eco, back in the 90s, wrote a book on this very topic, which was the search for a language of the angels. And this was something that preoccupied medieval philosophers and members of the clergy for a long time, which was trying to recreate the language of Adam that was supposedly lost. And so I think there's definitely a direct connection here. And, to your point, I think the intersection of interest in extraterrestrial life and this deeply human religious impulse, it's probably most obvious in UFO cults and things of that nature. So I think there's been this connection for a very long time.
Yeah, and let's kind of deconstruct the problem to be solved here. That is to say, how difficult it would be to communicate with another species. We can't even do it on Earth, even with other mammals, even with other primates, or even other humans that if we don't speak their language, it's not easy to do. So I love the discussion you have with John C. Lilly. I remember when that was all hot. I think there was even a film. I think what's his name? Scott. George C. Scott played a Lilly-like character who had dolphins in a pen, and they were communicating with them through these recording devices. I forget the name of the Day of the Dolphin. It might have been called. But how difficult it would be to communicate with a cetacean because it's in the water. And whatever aliens are going to be like, it's going to be way harder even than that.
Oh, absolutely. And the interesting thing I think about the history of, just thought about how we would go about communicating with an extraterrestrial intelligence is that for about the first half from the early 60s when Lilly was really doing his work, really up until I would say the mid 80s, early 90s, intelligent animal life on Earth was really considered to be a promising analog for communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. I personally think that's kind of a flawed way of going about it based on work Chomsky has done on human language, which he claims is qualitatively different than animal communication systems. And he actually argues that the biological prerequisites aren't even present in non-human primates for language. So he's saying that we're dealing with something completely different. So Sagan, Lilly, Drake, they were all very interested in dolphins as a potential analog for interstellar communication. But Lilly was ultimately unsuccessful. And I think based on what we know now about human language, that's not all that surprising.
Yeah, I think Sagan begged out on that after he found out Lilly was giving the dolphins LSD. It's like, okay, there's not real science going on here. There's something else going on. What's the problem to be solved for extraterrestrial languages? That is, what is a language? How is that different from communication, like bees have communication or whatever, in terms of solving this problem of how do we communicate with an extraterrestrial? You were starting to talk about Chomsky and getting into the theory of languages.
Yeah, so the fundamental problem here, and I think this is something that goes back to the really early days of SETI is that once upon a time, people looked at intelligent animals as a promising analog for extraterrestrial intelligence and communicating with them, simply because we know that there are a variety of animal species on Earth that seem to have pretty sophisticated communication mechanisms, which suggests that there should possibly be some way to talk to them. However, with Chomsky's work in linguistics starting in the 60s and getting more developed over the more recent decades, he basically made a very strong and compelling argument, in my opinion, that the biological prerequisites of human language aren't actually present in other animal species. So human language is something qualitatively different from how animals are communicating, and that the biological mechanisms aren't even found in our closest relatives, like non-human primates specifically. So I think that these early attempts to communicate with animals as a extraterrestrial analog, they weren't successful, and I don't think that's all that surprising given what we know about human language today.
Is it not just complexity, but something deeper, like conveying a thought, as opposed to communicating something simple, like directionality?
Yeah. And I mean, I think, Chomsky obviously was arguing that language is not primarily a means of communication. It's actually a way of expressing thought. So what is happening is when we're speaking right now, we are externalizing our thoughts, but really language is a function of the brain that is meant to order our thoughts internally. And the way we are expressing them right now in a linear fashion is more or less just an artifact of our other physical systems. So like the way our vocal cords are arranged and things of that nature. So I think a really great example of that is he has a sentence that is birds that fly instinctively swim, and instinctively birds that fly swim. And so, and animal communication researchers argue that the linearity of language is actually, what makes it language as such. And so lots of primates have demonstrated the ability to manipulate symbols to this end. And what Chomsky showed in that is that language, as humans use it, is actually a hierarchical recursive system. And this has not been demonstrated in any animal species. And so from that, he argues that the way the human brain is working is actually quite different. And to that earlier example, birds that fly instinctively swim and instinctively birds that fly swim, it's unclear in that sentence what instinctively is modifying. And so, but if you look at the higher order language, the hierarchical structure of language, you'll see that instinctively, even though it occurs closer to fly in the first sentence, structurally, it's actually closer to fly in the second sentence. And so that you're not seeing in any sort of animal species.
Yeah. Yeah, we've published a couple articles in Skeptic on animal language / communication in a debate format. That is, are they really communicating, or is it something just like a higher order operant conditioning? And I tend to side on fall on the side of the skeptics. I think there's a lot of sort of clever Hans effect. I remember seeing, I think, what's her name? Penny Patterson, the Coco the Gorilla's, whatever you call her, trainer or experimenter or whatever. And I think it was at TED where she was showing this video going, here, you can clearly see this language thing. And everybody's looking going, what, where exactly what, and it, if you start off thinking I'm observing, an intelligent communicating language using primate, you might find that. But to somebody who doesn't know what they're supposed to see or hear, it's not obvious. I think one of her examples was the first time Coco, it might have been one of the other primates like Washu, saw a duck, they signed water bird. This is always an example that's used like, oh, look, it created a new word. To me, I'm not sure that's not just chance and or something like a higher order operant conditioning.
I mean, I am totally in agreement with you there. And when you look at these animal experiments, it's like it is somewhat surprising that they're able to manipulate and form what appear to be new sentences and, ask for things. But this is taught over the time span of, a decade. And so that's plenty of time, I think, personally, for operant conditioning to take effect. Or as you mentioned, it could just be pure chance. And, for that matter, several animal species have demonstrated some level of, or I guess rather different aspects that of language. So dolphins have the ability to refer to objects that aren't in their immediate environment. Again, that's based on what we understand about dolphin communication. So it's unclear whether are they really saying sargassum or are we just interpreting this as such.
Yeah. I have a chocolate lab named Hitch, named after Christopher Hitchens, and he's dumb as a post, but he can communicate quite clearly when he's hungry, when he wants to go for his walk, and when he wants his ball, and so on. But that's not language.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think what we're really getting into then is the question of, well, what is language? And so, and that's fundamental to this idea of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence, because if language really is something that is based on the biological structure of the human brain and these cognitive modules that Chomsky is talking about, well, we better hope that extraterrestrials have a functionally similar mechanism and can think in ways that are recognizable to us, or that our thinking would be recognizable to them.
Yeah.
And I think there's actually a pretty strong argument that that would be the case.
Yeah, presumably if we encountered an extraterrestrial intelligence, and by encounter I mean actually had some linguistic connection to them, not just say finding a Dyson sphere like Tabby Star. I don't know if you follow that story. There's the sun is being blotted out by way more percent than normal. It could just be a lot of comets or planets or debris, or it could be something like a Dyson sphere or solar panels or something like that. The latter would communicate to us. It'd be a signal that there's an intelligence there. It's not natural, but that's not communicating with them. That's just a signal that we've picked up. What we would presume that some intelligence able to build, say, solar panels in a Dyson sphere would have to be cognitively superior to us. Would that then imply they must have something like symbolic language like ours?
I think the answer to that question is yes. And interestingly enough, the first two people to propose why this would be the case were John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky, who were pioneers of artificial intelligence. And so they actually were both quite interested in extraterrestrial communication. And the reason for that was because they saw both pursuits as trying to look at the mechanisms of intelligence as objectively as possible. That is, without, the human factor playing into it. And Minsky's argument was that even if we're saying dealing with like an octopod, something that looks very different from humans, they're going to be faced with the same fundamental environmental constraints, which is limited resources, limited time. And so based on this, he's saying that the solutions that humans found to this, one of them being symbolic language, is actually a very ideal solution to these problems that you face. It allows you to not only combine ideas, but to transmit them very efficiently and across multiple generations. And so from this, he was saying, well, I think there's a very strong argument to be made that aliens would hit on similar solutions because we're faced with the same fundamental problems. And that was based on their definition of intelligence being a specific response to a given problem. So intelligence has domains.
Yeah, Tooby and Cosmides call that a cognitive niche, that we evolved in a physical environment. It's 3 dimensions. There's certain principles of physics that are going to be true on other planets. There'll be slightly different levels of gravity or whatever, but there's still going to be an up and down and a forward and back, and time will progress from past to present and so on. So their verbs and other words and adjectives and so on are going to be bound by the same principles of physics that we experience. So there should be some similarities there that we can then begin to tag and then translate somehow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is totally accurate. And the question, I think, then becomes, well, how much of what we treat as knowledge and information is a product of our own mind versus something that would be, objectively recognized as such? So a lot of attempts at designing interstellar messages start with basic math on the idea that, one, it's very easy to communicate because you can use ostensive representation. So just like one pulse represents the number 1. But also, presumably, basic arithmetic is something that would be recognizable to aliens. I think that is something of an open question. But again, if we're looking at, ideal solutions to certain problems, the ones we've hit, specifically basic ones like arithmetic, seem very likely to also be found by other intelligent species.
Right. And so if they're going to try to send a signal to us, they're going to try to send us a pattern that would not happen naturally, say, rotating neutron stars or black holes or something like that. So Sagan famously had Ellie Arroway use prime numbers as as the astronomer. She's looking for these prime numbers that cannot be naturally formed. So that was kind of a simple version of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's that kind of gets also more into how you, on the physical side of things, actually transmit a message. So if we're trying to distinguish, say, a neutron star from a message, you would look for things like these patterns, but also astrophysical phenomena tend to be spread across a very broad bandwidth of frequencies, whereas, at least SETI is looking for very narrow bandwidth, so it's concentrated energy in a very narrow frequency range. So there's also ways to communicate that this is an intelligent signal just based on how you actually encode the message into a given medium.
Yeah. And on that subject, I've kind of followed the debate on in evolutionary theory between contingency. Things are very, very random. And as Gould famously said, if you rewound the tape of life and played it again, there'd be nothing like us. And then people like Dawkins and Dennett said, well, what do you mean by us? I mean, if you just, obviously, if you mean a bipedal primate, no. But if you mean an intelligent communicating organism, you will get something like that. In as much as convergent evolution, you're likely to have, you need eyes and ears. And if you're on land, you need limbs. And you're going to have all the sensory apparatus on one end and the waste disposal, project on the other end. And so you might end up with something like a bipedal dinosaur or whatever. And I was trying to remember the name of the paleontologist who wrote the book. It was like Life Solutions. Simon Conway Morris. Simon Conway Morris.
Yes.
So he pushed back against Gould's contingency. Although oddly, he argued that we're probably alone in the universe, even though I thought his convergence argument made it the case that we would not be alone in the universe. I don't know if you read that book or how much you follow that debate.
Slightly. And I think the issue of convergence is particularly interesting when we're talking about intelligence, because when you look at things like the encephalization of the brain and like this tendency towards larger and more complex brains, that's actually one of the things that made dolphins seem such a promising candidate for interspecies communication. But where things start to get interesting then is if Chomsky is right and that our brain is actually more or less, I hate to use the term hardwired, but if these cognitive modules exist based on our actual biology, you would expect to see similar things start cropping up in other intelligent species. And his argument is that we don't, even in our closest ancestors. So there seems to be some almost evolutionary leap there, which isn't actually out of the question. It's not a deterministic march from amoebas to humans. So there is the space there for these sorts of leaps in intelligence. They're pretty rare as far as we know.
It may be unbelievably rare. I mean, another debate I got into is with Robert Wright. He wrote that book, Non-Zero, where he makes the case, it's kind of a convergent evolution, although in his case, it's, zero-sum games will be outplayed by non-zero games. That is to say, cooperation out-competes, competitiveness in the long run, and therefore you're going to end up with a kind of intelligence that we have. If it wasn't us, it would have been Neanderthals. If it wasn't Neanderthals, it would have been Homo erectus. If it wasn't Homo erectus, and so on. But what do you mean by us? Well, he means an internet-using technological society with the kind of language we have. Now, I think that might be going too far, but it's an interesting thought experiment. And we don't know, of course, if Neanderthals had the same kind of Chomsky-like language that we use. You look for those fossils. They had that bump in the skull or something that implies that their skull was rotated in such a way and had this structures. And I forget what the argument was, but that therefore they might have had the kind of language we have. I don't know.
Well, I think this is one of the great challenges too, because cooperation obviously does lead to evolutionary advantage as far as we can see. But on the same time, there's this debate in SETI about the so-called great filter, which is if you get too far along technological process, do those species end up inevitably wiping themselves out? And getting through that point, right now we're faced with these problems of like nuclear apocalypse, environmental collapse. And this is all from us being very intelligent, very technologically motivated species. Are we going to be able to move beyond that? And that is what they call the great filter. So maybe there is some sort of limit, and maybe intelligent life does crop up quite frequently, but it keeps hitting this barrier, kind of done in by its own intelligence.
Yeah, I follow that argument too. Pinker makes a great counter to that in Enlightenment Now. The idea that not that aliens would be evil, but that we would end up exterminating ourselves because we're bellicose, we're colonizing, we're violent, and so on. He says there is a species of highly intelligent, communicating beings who are not like that. They're called women.
I mean, yeah, like I'm not super familiar with Pinker's argument there, but I think just because we develop this way and have this, very deeply competitive impulse that coexists with our ability to cooperate, there's no reason that impulse might be much weaker in another intelligent species. And in fact, maybe that's what gets them through these problems we're facing on Earth right now.
In other words, it's sort of a guy's way of thinking about what the future of intelligence or AI or aliens are going to be like. Maybe they're not going to be like men. Anyway.
Yeah, and I mean, I think kind of on that point, like this debate we're having about artificial intelligence and whether or not it will ever be able to rival human general intelligence is interesting from the fact that we tend to think of it as like, well, it's a human creation, so it must embody both the best and the worst of human impulses. But perhaps if an AGI is created, it's going to embody the best of human principles without this weirdly competitive downside. So
right. Yeah, and you discuss, the aliens we may encounter may not be biological. They may be computers.
Yeah, in fact, I think the odds are likely that they will be post-biological. And the book you had mentioned earlier by Sagan and Tchaikovsky was actually kind of the first to bring that up and saying, if we do encounter intelligent life, it's probably going to be post-biological. And the reason for that just being a statistical analysis of looking at like, hey, Earth is very young relative to the age of the universe. So if life has cropped up earlier and managed to survive all these issues we're dealing with now, and given that we're already working on artificial intelligence, there's a pretty good bet that we might be talking with a computer.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's similar to the we might be living in the Matrix argument that, given the rate of progress and so on, the chances that a far future intelligence will have something like a virtual reality indistinguishable from you and I just sitting here right now. Therefore, who was it? Bostrom, I think, said we have a greater than 50% chance that we're living in the Matrix.
Yeah, I mean, I know Elon Musk is a big fan of that argument. I kind of resist it just because I think that at least the way Musk voices it kind of represents almost a fatalism in the sense that if there was some like fatalism in like the Calvinist sense, that if there was some entity that is controlling this simulation, well, we can only do what we do. So I don't know. I have issues with that line of thinking, I suppose, but I think it is, it's worth considering.
I had William Poundstone on the podcast. His book is called The Doomsday Formula. And it's the same kind of argument. He has a chapter on we're living in the Matrix, but also that it's like a 50% chance that doomsday will happen within 867 years. Because the analogy I use is if we had the history of humanity from start to finish, and the Copernican principle is that we're not special, so we're like right here in the top of the bell curve. And how long did it take to get from here to here in terms of population? So how much longer will it take to get another 7 billion people? Well, 867. So the world could come to an end here at 50%. It's these Bayesian analysis where you have nothing to plug in. There's no formula to plug in. It's not even as good as the Drake equation.
I mean, yeah, and I think there's a counter argument. I forget who voiced it, which is saying that actually, like, the odds are that we're somewhere directly in the middle. Just if you're looking at like statistical, like, probability of where we are in terms of the evolution of humans, like, chances are pretty good you're somewhere in that middle 50% as opposed to either of the end quadrants. So I don't know, definitely worth thinking about.
Yeah, so you have a nice history here of how scientists have thought about if we're going to send a signal or send a little plate on a spacecraft, what would you put on it such that somebody that's, who knows who would find it, can read it. So you have, like, in your appendices, you have some of these diagrams that they said. So walk us through a little bit about what the history of the science of this has been. Like, what do we put on the plate, or what do we put in the radio signal we send?
Sure. So, the idea of communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence, unsurprisingly, goes back quite a ways. In the 19th century, a number of pretty prominent mathematicians were thinking about it. Carl Friedrich Gauss, for instance, was very interested in this problem, and he suggested using basically a visual representation of the Pythagorean theorem. We would grow trees in the form of a triangle with the squares on each side, and we could communicate with the Selenites, who were presumed to live on the moon or perhaps even Mars. But these were interesting not because they were practical. Another astronomer suggested we dig trenches in the Sahara and light them on fire, fill them with oil, light them on fire to send messages. Wasn't going to happen, but they're notable for picking mathematics as the basis of communicating with intelligent species that are unlike us. So kind of after these weird initial ideas in France in the mid 20th century, the idea kind of got picked back up again. It was more focused on the technical side of things, such as, how would we actually go about communicating with someone who lived on Mars, for instance. They were really interested in using mirrors or the relatively new invention of electrical lights to kind of send Morse code messages. And I think that's fascinating because they take these very conventional human means of communication, such as Morse code, and just assume that would somehow be intelligible to an extraterrestrial, which, I mean, seems pretty far-fetched. But again, they were very interesting in the sense that they were focusing on math and thinking about what kind of math to send. Things, I think, really got interesting around the turn of the 20th century for reasons totally unrelated to communication with extraterrestrials, which was when people like Frege and Bertrand Russell started thinking about the logical foundation of mathematics. And, their ideas a lot of them anyway, didn't end up holding up in terms of the way philosophy developed, but they did lay the foundation for Freudenthal's first language, in the sense that Bertrand Russell was trying to formalize language. He had this idea that the world basically consists of all these independent objects, and that by describing the logical relations between them, you could excise the slippery nature of human language and make it logically rigorous so that you could determine the truth of a proposition without it actually knowing what the proposition is about. It doesn't really matter, the subject, which I think is really important for communicating with extraterrestrials, because they need a way to verify the things that are in their message. And so Freudenthal took this idea and he's like, well, communicating solely through a rigorous logical formal system, not interested in that. I want something that is more rooted in everyday life. So he started with mathematics, I don't even know if you can say it's like formalization, because that kind of undermines the idea of something being formalized. But he created this basic system where you start with ostensive representation. So you would pulse, say, one radio pulse would equal 1, 2 for 2, and then timing would be based on the length between the pulses. And from that, he tried to build a system that could communicate everything from physical sciences, facts about Earth, to human relations. And he kind of had some success there, but there was a lot to be desired. It was a very complicated system. He didn't really explain how we were going to translate these ideas into some physical medium. So that kind of bubbled in the background of SETI for 50 years, really, until more recently a Dutch mathematician named Alexander Ollengren proposed really a second generation of Freudenthal's language, which he called the lingua cosmica, or Linkos. And this was based on the lambda calculus and constructive mathematics. And so basically with his system, you were able to prove all of the propositions within the system itself. So it's self-checking. Aliens, if they receive this, would be able to basically run these formulas and check that they were understanding something correctly, which I think is it's a marvelous approach, I think. However, you still deal with this fundamental problem of how to link something that's symbolic to reality, and how do you bridge that gap? And it may be an intractable problem, but yeah, that's kind of the long, short history of.
Yeah, I mean, if you sent that to some scientist in another country, say, and said, just like one of these diagrams that you have in the appendix here, For those that are just listening to this, it's a bunch of dots and patterns and things like this that's impenetrable to me. And said, "What is that? I mean, could they figure it out?" And they're Homo sapiens.
Right. And I mean, so like if you take a look at the cover of the book there, if you had to guess
Yeah.
what that cover means, what would you think it meant?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would think it's trying to convey something from simple to complex, with building blocks that make more complexity, something like that.
Yeah, and so this system was actually sent into space in 1999 and 2003, and it's based on Freudenthal's language. But what's funny about it is that what's on the cover looks remarkably complex, but it's actually very simple. It's just counting from 0 to 1, or from 0 to 10 rather.
Oh, okay.
And so so what you see there is it's written in binary, and then they have specific symbols that relate the numbers, and so it's making an equivocation between binary. Yeah. And so, but I think to your point, it's not intuitive and it's not easy to understand. And, Frank Drake, funny enough, he found this out the first time he tried to design a prototypical interstellar message that actually eventually became the basis for the Arecibo message, the first to be sent into space. But he designed a message. It was based on a bitmap, so these kind of square-like pictures like on the cover. And he sent them out to a bunch of Nobel laureates, some of the smartest people he knew, and was basically like, here's a message. What does it mean?
Yeah.
No one responded. No one got it, except for one person kind of got it. His name is Barney Oliver.
Barney Oliver, right.
Yeah. Amazing technologist. He writes back to Frank Drake, and the message, Frank, when he decoded it, it was a picture of a martini glass with an olive in it. And so, clearly he did not understand the meaning of Drake's message, but he did understand how to decode it. So, I think when you think about the fact that some of the most brilliant people on Earth couldn't understand Drake's message, which was designed to be simple, it really puts the problem we're dealing with in perspective.
Yeah, in Contact, they had people that are good at breaking codes working on the extraterrestrial signal that came in, as if but codes are designed to not be able to be broken. Anyway. Right,
and I think and the difference between code and language, I think, is really integral to this, because we're not necessarily trying to speak in a code. We're trying to communicate. So we want to make this as simple and obvious as possible. The question is, what is simple and obvious for us? That's a very human-centric way of thinking about things.
Yeah, you had a discussion in here about the Doyle was talking about receiving a signal that began with the Fibonacci numbers. Dawkins, in one of his books, makes a point that there is a natural sequence of mating between two species, like an interrelationship between two species and when they breed and so on, that kind of ends up in a Fibonacci type number just because of the way the seasons operate or something like that, and the difference between the two species. So it's not guaranteed that something like a Fibonacci numbers would be artificial. It could be something like that.
Yeah, and Doyle is actually interesting because they've done a lot of work on information theory analysis of different signals. So they looked at, say, I guess I'll back up a little bit. When you look at human language and the distribution of words and even letters, it follows something called the zip slope, which is that the first most common language word in a given language, and most of them, in fact, occurs twice as often as the second most used word, and so on down the line. So it has this nice distribution curve. And so him and some people who were working on animal communication research back in the 90s applied this same technique to dolphins to see what the distribution of vocalizations in dolphins were. And it was surprisingly close. It followed a very similar distribution pattern, despite the fact that they had way less vocalization range than humans do in their language. But as it turns out, that might not be a great way of determining whether something is language or not, but it could determine whether something is of intelligent origin. So if you received a signal from space, you could basically apply an algorithm that looks for these distributions that we see in language as a sort of intelligence filter for unknown signals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then you had in your discussion on Minsky, the example of his proposal, he cited A for Andromeda, a television series written by the cosmologist Fred Hoyle, who turns out to be one of the most interesting characters in the history of science. Even though he's wrong about a lot of things, he had a lot of interesting ideas, in which Earth detects an extraterrestrial signal that contains instructions for building a computer that then relays instructions for creating a biological organism named Andromeda. So in other words, the aliens may not be coming in spaceships. They may not be sending objects. They may just send the code that tells us how to build the computer that will then, or the device that then builds the object that they want you to create.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a brilliant insight. This came from Minsky at the first joint U.S.-Soviet discussion on communicating with extraterrestrial intelligence. And they were trying to figure out, how do we code an image into 3 dimensions to make it, intelligible to aliens? Maybe we can send a picture of a cat. And Minsky was like, no, let's send the cat itself. And it's just like, wait, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, we basically send a computer that can run all this code and show all these things that you guys are trying to code into radio waves. No, let's just send the instructions to build this thing itself, which I think, given how artificial intelligence has progressed over the last 50 years, it's really a brilliant and prescient insight into, I think, probably one of the most, promising ways of designing a message would be to send the cat, don't send the picture of the cat.
Right. Or would it be something like send the instructions for how to build a 3D printer, and then here's the program for the 3D printer to build a cat, and then you have the cat. Yeah,
and speaking of code, as we were talking about earlier, we need to think about DNA, and is these 4 nucleotides that code for everything in life on Earth, is that something specific to our planet, or is that something we can expect to find elsewhere? And some actually really interesting recent research has shown that 4 nucleotides, and our specific 4, is actually a really optimal solution for creating DNA. They've managed to create it with 6 nucleotides and so on, but it's much harder to replicate depending on how many extra ones you add. So there's really good reason to think that aliens might have a 4 nucleotide based DNA structure similar to our own. And if that's the case, why not just send the code, the DNA for humans? And if their ability to create organisms in a lab is progressing anywhere as fast as ours is, it's not too far-fetched to think that they might be able to grow something based on that code.
I wonder if a human brain constructed by extraterrestrials would then learn their language.
Chomsky would say it would. Assuming their language is the same as ours.
Yeah, like a universal grammar algorithm you have built into the brain. Assuming they have something like grammar, they'd have to have grammar. That's the assumption, right? So that would be interesting. Yeah, I highlighted that because I was thinking of Paul Davies' argument for a second Genesis on Earth, that if you found some organisms that didn't have the 4-base DNA, they had some other replicating molecular sequence, that would be an example of a second creation on Earth. And so maybe looking for something like that. But I haven't followed that research in a few years, so I haven't seen that new study saying that the particular arrangement we have is probably the most efficient. So maybe earlier experiments failed because they weren't as effective.
Yeah, and a British astrobiologist named Charles Cockrell.
I had him on the podcast. He's a super interesting guy.
Yeah, he's really, really great guy, and he's done. He just had a book recently come out that's more or less on this subject of why life in the universe might not be as as alien, for lack of a better word, as you might expect it to be. And that's because just the laws of physics require certain biological structures, or rather make them more likely to emerge than others. So from cells to perhaps even the structure of our brain. So I think taking all these things into consideration, I really do think that if we communicate with an extraterrestrial intelligence, we can assume that they have a functionally equivalent cognitive mechanism, and that will provide the basis for communication.
Yeah, Dawkins had another line about we would know an extraterrestrial was intelligent if they understood evolution. In other words, the theory behind where we came from, that's a certain level of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it would apply to any planet. Well, this is what Cockrell says. All planets have gravity and so on. And so you're going to have certain characteristics that just restrain the size of organisms. Like, a microorganism in water, that's not like us going through water. They're not going to have a fish-like body. They're going to have a different kind of body to get through at that level. And that's going to apply everywhere, to those kinds of formulas.
Right. And I think you're hitting on one of the main, themes across the design of interstellar messages, which is looking for what we can, assume with a high degree of certainty we will share with an extraterrestrial intelligence. So, Minsky argued same fundamental restraints in terms of time and space and limited resources. But then also, just if the laws of physics are the same throughout the universe, which as far as we know they are, then you can expect biology to evolve in certain ways. And I think that that also applies to language. I mean, Chomsky had a great bit about how if an alien had symbolic language or just language in general that didn't have this underlying basis in the universal grammar, we wouldn't be able to understand it. We'd have to approach it like a physicist approaches physics and learn it over the course of generations. We wouldn't be able to understand even where to begin, really.
Yeah. Yeah. So, another one of these problems that I thought was interesting. I heard this one a long time ago as well, that let me back up. One of the interesting things about your book is that even if we never make contact with an extraterrestrial, all this stuff gets us to think about problems to solve here. For example, if you're going to bury nuclear waste for 10,000 years or 50,000 years and somebody finds it in that time frame, they're not going to be like us speaking English, and it won't even be like Shakespearean English. It's going to be something just completely we can't even think of. What symbols would you use to say, don't open this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting that when the DOE convened a task force back in the 70s to address this problem, among the people invited to this task force to say, how are we going to label nuclear waste so that it's understood 10,000 years in the future? A lot of them were already involved in SETI. And in fact, John Lomberg, who designed a lot of the Voyager Golden Record icons, was intimately involved with that. Carl Sagan was invited, but he didn't attend. But he still gave his opinion. And Sagan actually advocated for using the skull and crossbones. But that might not be as good of a option as we think, because if we think 10,000 years down the line, perhaps humans are post-biological. Say you come across the sign with the skull and crossbones, that might be more titular than it is a warning. It's like, we can go look at all these fleshy ancestors we used to have. Let's just start digging, and it might not turn out so well. So,
right.
Yeah, even on Earth, these symbols can have a variety of meanings.
Yeah, I think you said that was much more Western, and that Eastern cultures don't use a skull and crossbones. Hard to get out of those anthropomorphic centrisms we have.
Oh, yeah.
So talk a little bit about the golden record on the Voyager missions and how that came about and what's on it and how locked into the 70s that is.
Yeah, so I mean, the Voyager golden records definitely grew out of an earlier kind of project on the Pioneer probes. They had a smaller plaque, it depicted two naked humans, kind of a design showing the trajectory of the spacecraft as it flew through space. And that kind of got raked through the coals. For one thing, there was like 3 people working on designing it. It wasn't really representative of humanity. The people look clearly Caucasian. So if you're an alien who discovers this, you're going to have a very skewed view of what humanity is. So when it came time to send Voyager 1 and 2 out into space and eventually into interstellar space, Sagan and a small group of people, including his wife at the time, Linda, designed a record. And on the record are hundreds of images of Earth and mathematical concepts. There's sounds, there's greetings in dozens of languages. And it was really meant to be a more comprehensive view of life on Earth and human knowledge. Still very limited for several reasons. One, because extraterrestrials probably never going to discover it, which Sagan and all the designers were well aware that the odds of someone finding this are basically nil. But, brought humans together, got them inspired about space, so it's worthwhile. It's also worth thinking about, if an extraterrestrial finds this, are they going to have a record player? Well,
right. We don't even have record players anymore.
I was going to say, I don't even have one in my house. I have some friends who do, but, a record might not actually be such a bad idea just because it demonstrates our ability to take sound and encode it in like the variations in the record itself. And so an extraterrestrial, if they did, atomic analyzation of the record, might see these very small divots and be able to extract information from that. But it's coded in a certain way, so they're going to have to know the code. They're probably not going to be able to get really anything off of it other than knowing that we were able to build this level of technology in 1977.
Yeah.
But, I think one of the more interesting things is that they use the energy transition of an atomic of a hydrogen atom as kind of the key to the whole thing in terms of figuring out numbers and time, which I think is a very interesting approach, given that hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe. So it might be something that is more recognizable to an extraterrestrial intelligence than really anything else. So they were definitely applying very rigorous, I guess, logic to the design, but it was limited by the time.
Yeah, but still an improvement over the Pioneer. The Pioneer, there was some controversy over having the male and female nude, right?
Yeah.
Now, if you did it, it'd probably be controversial because, where's the LGBTQ variety of genders and so on? And you can't just show man and woman because there's not just two. And
I think, to your point, I guess the struggles of designing these messages is how do you create a message that's inclusive? Like, how do you actually create a message that embodies what life is like on Earth? Like, you're going to have to cut some stuff out. And so what do you decide to include? What do you decide to not include? And that is why I personally think that thinking about this problem, even if we're not going to send any messages into space, which I don't think we should, it's a waste of resources right now, but we should still think about how we would design them because it forces us to address these issues and it forces us to think about what's important.
So you don't think we should be doing that just for economic reasons?
Yeah, I think like when you look at SETI, they are able to scan thousands of targets across billions of wavelengths. We still haven't found anything. Whereas sending a message, especially a robust one with lots of information, takes a ton of energy, and you're only able to really target a single star at a time.
Right.
And so if we don't know where we're shooting, and for what it's worth, most messages that have been sent into space are complete publicity stunts. Even the scientific ones, there's probably no chance that they will be received.
Right. Right. Yeah. When was the last one? 2003?
No, there was actually one last year, and directly the year before that, Douglas Backuck runs the METI Institute, and he did a couple. They're called the sonar messages, and he got a bunch of musicians from the Sonar Festival in Europe.
Oh, right. That's right.
Short things. Yeah.
And there's been scientists and others objecting to messaging the cosmos because the aliens might be evil. They might be coming here to consume our resources or whatever. Again, I think that's sort of a guy way of thinking about this. A species that gets that far that they're able to traverse the vast distances of interstellar space and manage to land here, they're probably not the kind of species that left because they ran out of resources. They should be able to solve those kinds of problems locally.
Right. I mean, I think that argument says a lot about the mind state of the people who advance it. And so if you're worried that, I guess, we're going to reveal our place in the universe and we might get invaded by some malevolent extraterrestrial intelligence, I think that says a lot about your view of intelligence in general and that it must necessarily be malevolent. I think it's also kind of a bogus argument in that we are doing a piss poor job of keeping quiet. Like we have been leaking radiation. And so if they have any level of technological sophistication beyond our own, they probably know where we're at. And, so I think there's a good reason not to transmit. I just don't think that's one of them.
I think a better argument would be like the one about AGI. They'll be so far advanced than us, they won't even know that they're exterminating us, like us with anthills or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's something we're struggling with here on Earth and in terms of the ethics of developing AI and, will it be something that we lose control of and what will it think about us? Like, because are we just a resource consuming thing that needs to be exterminated so it has more energy and,
Yeah, I think it's so hard to conceive of what an extraterrestrial would be like simply because they're not going to be just slightly ahead of us. Like with the Roswell story, they have, computer chips and we're still at the vacuum tube stage. So they helped us, we back engineered, in the 1950s from the 1947 Roswell crash, the new computer technology as if the aliens are just like 5 years ahead of us. It's not going to be like that. Just in terms of the evolutionary time scale, they'd be 10,000, 100,000, a million years ahead of us. And so if you took Moore's law and you take all those doublings and if you take someone like Ray Kurzweil's singularity arguments, where he makes those kinds of doubling arguments across all technologies, and then you plug it into a far future AI or an extraterrestrial that's 100,000 years ahead of us from starting with, say, basic technology we have, say, in 1900. It's just, we can't even imagine what they're going to be able to do.
Yeah, and I mean, Sagan and Shklovsky argue that they're likely millions of years ahead of us, if not perhaps over a billion. But really, when you look back at human history and how far we've just come in 500 years, they wouldn't have to be that far ahead of us to perhaps be significantly more advanced. So even if we're talking in terms of a few thousand years, that could be almost unrecognizable to us.
Yeah. So given that, what is your opinion, or what's your answer to the Fermi Paradox? Where is everybody?
That is a great question. I personally think that the universe is likely awash in communication. We just haven't developed the technology to kind of eavesdrop in. I think once we develop whatever that technology may be, then we'll likely find that there are people talking. So when you think about it, SETI is using radio, which is a 100-year-old technology, so still relatively new. But why on earth, like, what an inefficient way to talk. And we're just beginning to understand how to manipulate quantum systems. We haven't even really begun optical searches in terms of lasers, which can pack way more information into a given amount of energy. So beyond radio, we should start looking at optical systems. And then beyond that, who knows what's down the line? And I think that's probably, at least what I think, why we're not hearing anyone. We're just, we're using a telegraph and everyone else is talking on a phone.
Right. So, but some of that's limited by the electromagnetic spectrum. It's going to be somewhere on there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's why I personally think that we really need to expand the optical search and also consider optical communication, namely lasers. That's a little bit harder to search for because you'd be looking for ultra fast flashes of laser light. So you'd have to have basically a planetary wide survey going all the time to look for these milliseconds in time that a pulse is coming in. But, in terms of if we want to send a lot of information very far away, lasers are probably the best way to do it.
Now, why is it? I don't know the physics of that. Why are lasers better than radio?
So I'm going to do probably a poor job of explaining this, but with radio, in terms of the amount of energy you need to pack into a given frequency to broadcast on it, you can condense that energy into a single bandwidth of light. And so because you can do that, if you're an alien looking at Earth, we have a very bright object behind us that's smeared across the electromagnetic spectrum. So sunlight is all over. So you're going to have to differentiate this laser light. But because you can do it in a very narrow frequency of light, you can pack a ton of energy into that laser, and it'll basically look like a flash on their spectrum against the backdrop of sunlight. And so that, I think, is a huge benefit of using lasers. But then as opposed to radio, you're competing with a very, very noisy universe. And you're also competing with things such as the window that, say, on Earth, we can only hear a very narrow spectrum of the radio spectrum just because of the nature of our atmosphere. And who knows what the nature of extraterrestrial atmosphere is. So you're kind of hoping that they have either a very similar atmosphere to us, or that you just happen to broadcast in just the right frequency that can make it through to them. So there's a lot stacked against it. I think that's also, for what it's worth, a good reason to build a receiver on the moon, because you don't have to deal with these atmospheric effects. You can look at a far broader spectrum of radio. So
on the backside of the moon.
Yeah. So you don't have to deal with interference from terrestrial communications, but then you're also not limited to the 10 gigahertz or whatever it is of spectrum that we are on Earth. So maybe everyone is talking and we can't hear it because the atmosphere is blocking it.
Yeah, one of the best arguments I've heard, or I think of for being chronically frozen and coming back, say, 1,000 years from now, is just to see what the solutions were. Like, oh my God, so that's what we were doing wrong. That's what dark matter is. Oh, that's the solution to Fermi's Paradox or whatever it is. It'll be so obvious to them that we can't even think of it now.
Yeah, and I mean, there's been so much thought poured into this problem that perhaps we've already hit on the solution, but policy or economics just haven't caught up. So if you were to approach someone and say, let's build a dish on the backside of the moon, it could help us talk to aliens. Most people are going to laugh you out of the room and say, no way.
Well, you need a billionaire to just put his own money up or something like that.
Right.
Well, the Russian guy, Milner, I mean, he's doing the, what's his project called?
So he has Breakthrough.
Breakthrough, yeah. But that's two of them, right? Then he has the other one where he's going to send a postage-sized spaceship to, I mean, literally a tiny little thing to Proxima Centauri system, something like that.
Actually, and so that is Breakthrough Starshot, and the way they want to do that is using like megawatt scale lasers to propel like a solar sail, basically. An interesting kind of intersection with communicating with extraterrestrial intelligences is that if we're doing that, stray radio beams may actually be broadcasting to other planets. So it's actually a pretty good beacon mechanism as well. So it can kind of get 2 for 1 there. But again, who's going to, build these lasers? A lot of the technology still has yet to be built or tested. So
yeah, my answer to the Fermi Paradox is that there probably are out there. There may not be as many that got all the way to the point of communicating with technologies that we could detect. In other words, you could be all the way up to the Neanderthal level and no one would know you're there. And that is an amazing level of development. To have, a 1600 cc brain with hands and tools and maybe some art, but that's it. I mean, the point I made to Robert Wright in his non-zero argument is that Neanderthals had Europe to themselves for hundreds of thousands of years. There's very little progress in their toolkits, for example. And they don't show the same kind of cave painting type symbolic art. They might have had some simpler. Anyway, you could get all the way to there on some other planet, and we would never know that they're there. And that's, so I think there's probably a lot out there. And the other argument I make is that the it's so vast and the distances are so far between planets. Seth Shostak at SETI makes this analogy, that if Voyager were going to the Proxima Centauri system, which is the closest one, which it's not going to, but if it did, even hauling ass at 40,000 miles an hour, it would take like 70,000 years to get there. And as he jokes, that's a long time to sit there with your tray table down and your seat back. I mean, it's just big and empty.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that when I think about it in these terms really just is what still continues to inspire awe in this project is like SETI has done a pretty good job of scanning the closest stars to Earth, which we're talking tens of light years. So even if we were to know for a fact that an extraterrestrial intelligence sent us a message from a star 50 light years away, you're probably going to be dead by the time you can do a back and forth message like most people on Earth today would be. But we're not even talking 50 years or 100 years at this point. Like if we receive a message from an extraterrestrial intelligence, it'll probably be thousands. And when you think about the course of human history and just how brief like our ability to communicate in spaces, it's been 100 years out of like 4,000 years of just having written language.
Right.
So to think that, if we send a message to get a response, it would be another 10,000 years. Well,
right.
Yeah, it's both, I think, kind of hopeless, but like also, there's a good reason to do it, I think. So I don't know.
When that story about Tabby Star broke, I was on this LA radio show, John and Jillian, afternoon talk radio. And so, so we were talking about this, and they had somebody from, they had, what's his name? George Noory on, the late night AM coast to coast, right? So they're totally into all the conspiracies and aliens and Area 51 and all that stuff. So, and this guy, George, was sort of playing up that, my inside sources tell me there's a good chance that this is extraterrestrial technology, a Dyson sphere kind of thing, or giant solar panels or something like that. So Jillian's first answer, well, what are they like? Well, what's who like? The aliens. It's like, oh my God, it's just this signal that took 1,450 years to get here. It's 1,450 light years away. So if we send a signal to them and then we waited for a response, we're talking 3,000 years before we're going to hear. It's just it's, to the average person, even to me, it's just unfathomable how big and far apart everything is.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the things that makes SETI so hard to justify is people are like, well, why on earth, like my grandkids aren't even going to hear back from these aliens. Why on earth would we want to spend money on this? And I think that like that's a valid criticism, and I think why we should probably invest way more money in SETI and listen, because just receiving a message, even if we're not going to be able to send and reply, just receiving a message would change the course of human history.
Yeah.
Like, so.
Yeah. What's the group up? There's a group up in Berkeley that does, what is it? The astrotheology or some cosmotheology or something like that. They did a survey of asking religious people, how would your religious beliefs change if we discovered extraterrestrial intelligences? And it wasn't as bad as they thought. Like most people go, it's okay. I mean, my God is big enough to have created other aliens. Well, did Jesus go to every planet and die for their sins or, whatever? I mean, you can get kind of crazy there, but I don't think it would be, I don't think the stock market would collapse and, that the economy would go, in haywire and people would lose their religion. I think it would just expand our thinking, but in a pretty big way, for sure. We're not alone. That's pretty big. Or as Sagan said, even if we are alone, that's also pretty big and important to know. So that kind of gets to the last chapter of your book of Who Speaks for Earth, or the last section of your book. So that was really moving. So who speaks for Earth?
I think we're still trying to figure that out. And, to this point of why it's worthwhile to invest in these things as a society, I think in America, we love to fear-mongering works really well. And right now, China actually has the largest telescope that is actively used for searching for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's called FAST. And so it's worthwhile to think about, if we did receive a message and only one country has the ability to receive it, that's some pretty significant intelligence there. And there's no reason to think that they would share it, or that, there's a great book called The Three Body Problem, and it's about, what happens when a specific society has the ability to, I guess, dominate communication across interstellar space. And Shizhen Liu doesn't paint a very pretty picture of that. And, perhaps it won't turn out that way, but, it's worthwhile thinking about, just because with this question of who speaks for Earth, if only one society is speaking for Earth, whether it's China, America, Russia, or anyone else, that is going to be a very biased message. It's going to, it's going to show one very narrow side of the story. The harder question is then, well, as we had kind of talked about earlier, how do you decide what to put in? Someone's going to be left out at some point.
Yeah.
And so that's a very deep philosophical conversation that we should be having as a society. And I think ultimately a very strong reason to think about METI and to think about, designing these messages. So
isn't there a UN protocol on what happens if we detect a signal?
Yeah, there is. And there's, various schematics for how to rate, I guess, like how serious it is or how important the information it is. I think the SETI committee at the Astronautical Congress, they are very optimistic in the sense that they're like, yeah, we need to let people know, like it should be a controlled release of information. So you don't want, just to blast it out on social media necessarily, but, it should be shared across the world. The UN should have access to this, but the UN should be doing a lot of things, and it doesn't always turn out that way. So who knows? And
it doesn't have a lot of teeth to enforce it in any case. I mean, if Putin or Xi or Kim Jong-un received the extraterrestrial, they're not going to share it with us. No way. That's not going to happen.
Why would you? And for all we know, why would America share it with anyone else either? We don't.
Right.
It takes a lot of faith to assume that we would do the right thing.
That's right. Well, I mean, the idea, I guess, would be that, we could back engineer from the message, gravity transportation, anti-gravity transportation systems or something. I mean, that's what some of the ufologists believe, that the Nazis encountered extraterrestrials, and that's where they got the idea for the V2 rocket and the Messerschmitt jet, the ME-263, I think it was, the first jet, as if the jet engine is the most advanced thing the aliens could think of, which is, that much better than a regular propeller engine.
Yeah, they figured out how to get here, but with a jet engine.
Yeah, right.
Really incredible.
Of course, that was L. Ron Hubbard's, the DC-9s coming from the planet Xenu. It's just too much. Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that discussion, who speaks for Earth. Again, it doesn't matter if we ever make contact or not. It's just sort of a way of getting us all to think more universally. When I wrote the moral arc, that was, let's say, 2014, published in 2015. I wrote the last chapter kind of speculating about the eventual demise of nation states. And, this whole idea is only a couple centuries old. We are by nature tribal, but we've overcome a lot of our tribalisms. And, economic borders have become more porous. Maybe political borders will eventually disappear and all that stuff. Last couple of years haven't borne out well for my thesis that we're heading in this direction. We've become sort of more tribal, more economic nationalism, populism, authoritarianism. I'm a little discouraged by that, as if the progress is not inevitable. We're not necessarily going to get AGI equivalent or necessarily become something like a super advanced extraterrestrial intelligence just by the progress we've made. It could go south.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that, again, coming back to why this is important, is when you think about communicating with another intelligent species, perhaps in another galaxy or at least in another solar system, it forces you to address universals and like what is going to be universal not only amongst humanity but between our two perhaps wildly different cultures. And so I think having this universal perspective in every sense of the word is a very, very enlightened one to have, and one that we could use a lot more of today, because it's a truism and very trite to say, but there's more in common with humans than there are different, even down to the fact that the way language works. We might speak different languages, but we think there's something fundamental that we all share.
Yeah. So, I try to make the argument, I'm not sure I'm successful at it, that we are discovering certain moral principles, like the principle of interchangeable perspectives. The Copernican principle, I'm not special. You're like me. If I suffer, you probably suffer. And therefore, if I don't want to suffer, I shouldn't treat you in a certain way, and so on. And this is sort of Peter Singer's argument for animal rights. We've been expanding this moral sphere to encompass more and more people that we do recognize as suffering. Going back to Jeremy Bentham's argument about animals, it's not can they think or can they talk, but can they suffer? And that, you can kind of make an argument, I do, that we're becoming more recognizing more of that for more humans and then now more sentient beings. Or something like John Rawls's argument for a just society, that you have to pretend like you don't know which group you're born into. You don't know if you're black or white, male or female, and so on, so that you should design laws that make it fair for everybody. So I always think, if extraterrestrials get to the level where they can do what they can do, will they have also discovered, assuming natural selection operates in the same kind of way and you end up having competitiveness and cooperativeness, and then if you have that kind of cognition and symbolic language, you would be able to think, I'm interchangeable with you. Like Pinker makes this argument again, I think this is in The Better Angels of Our Nature, that the way language operates symbolically, like if you're a hunter, so we both use this historian of science who's also a tracker. So like one of the things trackers do is they can look at a footprint or an indentation of the dirt where the animal was sleeping and now it's gone. But they could think, okay, if it was here last night, then it was over there tomorrow. And then you can interchangeably exchange like today and tomorrow, there and there, and him and her, and so it becomes I forget the phrase you used, an interchangeably complex symbolic. I forget what the exact words were, but that kind of cognition that should apply to discovering moral values, and so there's kind of a moral Flynn effect. We're getting better at abstract reasoning over time. You know about the Flynn effect, where IQ scores are going up 3 points every 10 years. Yeah. So James Flynn's argument is that it's not on the arithmetic and vocabulary sections of the IQ test. It's the abstract reasoning, like where you have to rotate those three-dimensional figures in space, and that people are getting better at that. Not just the test-taking effect, but overall, because our culture is more digitized and more symbolic and depending on abstract jobs. And so we're not in agriculture or industry as much as we are in these, kind of information jobs. And that, so again, you extrapolate that out to your extraterrestrials, they should be doing something like that. This is my argument for why they're probably not evil. But in any case, it sort of makes an argument that they would be more moral than us. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling here, but it's super interesting.
I think that's fascinating. I think it makes a lot of sense to me, honestly. Just thinking again to that great filter effect. Unless we figure out how to cooperate better and how to, I guess, recognize these moral similarities across cultures. Like, despite all the different cultural mores that you might find between, like, say, here and I lived in India for a bit, and like some of the like, ethical guidelines there, it's like, man, like, just this is so foreign to my understanding, but it's something that's been done in this culture for thousands of years. But at the same time, there's certain prohibitions against like killing and things that you'll find across human cultures. And I think, to your point, there's probably deeper moral lessons that are, like you said, more discovered than, I guess, dictated by some, whoever happens to be in power. So hopefully we can find our way there before we annihilate ourselves. But,
yeah, well, I'm a fan of all the literature, game theory literature on, the Cold War and mutual assured destruction and all that. On the other hand, and that I like that because it's sort of a rational, scientific way of solving a social problem. On the other hand, here we are 75 years later, and we still haven't solved this problem. I mean, there's still nuclear weapons. We're still kind of hoping that the mutual assured destruction thing works. It won't work with suicide terrorists who are looking forward to going to heaven and can't wait to blow everybody up. And, this still seems, there's another three-body problem.
Right. Yeah. I mean, they're very deep issues. And yeah, I would like to think that there perhaps is some answer, or that someone else more intelligent than ourselves have found it, but lacking any evidence on Earth, it's hard to say.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Daniel, we've been going for well over an hour. I love the book. What are you working on next?
I'm actually working on a book about mental health and technology. So that's still...
oh my God! That sounds what's the thesis of that?
It's more of a question at this point. Still very early days for this, but the question is whether or not the way technology is affecting our psychology is something fundamentally different, or just a new expression. So things that we see on the internet, for instance, like a very simple example would be internet addiction.
Right.
Is that just an underlying manifestation of addiction and impulse disorder, or is this something fundamentally new? And so everything from VR to internet to cell phones.
Oh yeah, that's a Wired magazine kind of subject. I've been following that a little bit recently. Let's see, Gene Twangy's book iGen, and then Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianov's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. So here the debate is, there's been like a threefold increase in rates of depression and anxiety, suicidal ideation for women, about 2 times increase for men. And the question is why? So Twangy thinks it's the use of social media, because that's kind of when it kicks in after 2007 with Facebook and Twitter and so on. And that girls are more affected because they're more driven by, or they're more affected by social relationships that can be so nastily manipulated on social media. Although there was a study then published, I don't know, a couple months ago that said that refuted the social media depression correlation. In any case, it's one of those ongoing, need more research areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, because it's still really early days researching this book, I'm less familiar with the gender disparity, but I do think it's really interesting that on a generational scale, like the so-called digital natives are seeing massive rises in mental disorders that really are far greater than any other age group. So, causation and correlation obviously aren't the same thing, but it is really interesting that
Twangy's got the data. You should look at that. That it started sort of keeping track of when iGeners, kids born in 1995, started college, which was 2013. It was right around 2013 when the reported rates of anxiety disorders, depression, suicidal ideation kind of spikes up in colleges. I get that. I'm a professor at Chapman University, and I noticed I've started getting more of these disability letters from the Disability Services Department excusing students from various activities because they have a disability. They don't tell me what it is, but the students tell me, well, I suffer from anxiety or depression. It's like, wow, okay. So something's going on there, and that could be related to social media, technology of some kind. Who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I definitely think it's there's a overwhelming amount of evidence that shows that technologies can exacerbate underlying mental disorders. I think a far more interesting question is, can any of them be directly attributed to it? Like, are we seeing more depression because we're getting better at recognizing it, because it's been less stigmatized, or is it actually due to network effects and technology? And that, as you mentioned, very understudied area. So I think it's going to be a fascinating kind of dive.
Whose book is it that said you should give up the 10 reasons you should give up social media and technology? What's his name? I'm missing it now.
One of the people that I always think of when I think about like pessimistic takes on how technology is affecting us is Nicholas Carr. I don't know if that's who you're.
Oh, that wasn't who I was thinking of. I'll look it up. I'll find it here. But go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think the jury is still out on this. There's a ton of evidence on each side, but I also think, technology shows a lot of promise in treating us. I think VR therapies are very interesting in terms of how clinicians are exploring exposure therapy. And so,
Jaron Lanier, 10 arguments for deleting your social media accounts right now.
I mean, I support that. I'm only on Twitter because I have to be for my job, and I have no other social media, and I would recommend it for everyone.
You don't do You don't do Facebook? No.
I haven't for years.
Yeah. I like Twitter. I swear I'm going to stop using it except for marketing reasons. Like, we have a lecture coming up or the next issue of Skeptic or whatever. It's great for that. Then I can't help myself. I get on there and I start commenting, and, an hour later I'm still on there. And yeah, it's a huge time suck.
Yeah, I try to tell myself, like, I've done everything in my power to limit my Twitter use so that it's purely for professional reasons, because working in media, you can't really afford to unplug, or at least I've yet to find a way. Like you said, every time it comes creeping back is a time it sucks. So,
well, if you're a political commentator, you have to be on Twitter, especially. I mean, the president himself. That's pretty much the press conference every 5 minutes or 3 a.m, or it's unbelievable.
Yeah, in lieu of press conferences, really.
Well, you're gonna have a good time writing that book because the subject's changing all the time, and it's super important. So, well, Daniel, again, congratulations on the book, Extraterrestrial Languages. Really enjoyed it. Super thought provoking. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
All right. Bye bye.
Bye bye.